Southeast Asia, human geography, history. We'll be specifically spending a lot of time on the history dealing with Southeast Asia or South Asia and Southeast Asia and European interaction. Let's get started. All right, so what this picture illustrates is, we'll get into it in a second, but we'll talk a little bit about the Silk Road. And the Silk Road is one of the concepts that we'll touch on that I want to highlight on a little bit. Okay. But let's go for the first things, the first brief concepts. And once again, this is not a history of entirely of Southeast Asia. I am primarily focusing on contact with Europeans. Okay, so Southeast Asia, the primary points I'll be focusing on as its contact with Europe. So let's get started. 70,000 BCE, we start seeing the first interaction, first Homo sapiens settle in Southeast Asia. 1st century BCE is the establishment of the Silk Road, and that is what we're looking at as far as this illustration. What the Silk Road is, and this kind of shows you a little better what the Silk Road is it's the early trade routes. It actually covers the majority of the culture herfs. It is the old world culture herfs it covers 4 of the culture herfs: Nile River Valley, Mesopotamia, Indus River Valley, into some of it in the Indus River Valley, and the Yellow River Valley. It's just the way it's the trade routes that connected Asia to North Africa and even Southern Europe. And it's the different trade routes where we had the fusion of culture, the fusion, of course, of technology, religion, trade, all of those things, okay? Ideals, resources, all of those things. So it was very, very, very important because it dealt with the diffusion of between the major civilizations of that time. It was the routes that was, if you take a look and see, it was the diffusion of all the major concepts and ideas. So you can trace the spread of religious concepts, economic concepts, technology, all of those things along the Silk Road. All of these things occurred along the Silk Road. All right, so let's get back to the timeline. About 200 AD, we start seeing the Thai people move into areas between China and Southeast Asia. Let's skip forward to about the 1400s to 1600s. Marco Polo establishes trade with China and introduces Christianity to the region. Very simple concept, very similar concept to what we saw, to what we witnessed in earlier chapters or earlier units when we discussed European contact. Okay, oftentimes you'll see the contact. Religion is introduced. Remember we said God's guns and glory, or God's golden glory. I'm sorry. Religion is introduced. You see a trade introduced, and eventually a superior military power of the Europeans will, after the religion and trade have been introduced, you start seeing the military power, the superior military power, impose its will politically. So right around 1648 AD, we start seeing the first European trade post established. And remember, let's go back. The Silk Road had nothing to do with. This is not the type of Western European colonization. This is old world colonization. This is old world. The Silk Road is old world. North Africa, Mesopotamia, Indus River Valley. Okay, this is when we start talking about these things with Europe. This is new world, new civilizations. Okay, so skipped around a little bit. We start seeing Spain back to 1565. Spain establishes a post in the Philippines. Once again, Spain introduces Christianity to the native people. Between the 1600s, we start seeing the Dutch, 1600s, 1650s, the Dutch begin to colonize Indonesia. Skipping forward to 1839 through 1856, we start seeing China. It loses the 2 Opium Wars to European powers between Great Britain and France. And what ended up occurring as a result of China losing the Opium Wars, which were China had to end up giving up its ports. So it had to end up allowing Europeans to trade, because Japan and China for the longest time did not allow any outsiders. Remember, I mentioned earlier that China developed pretty much independently on its own. In the other videos, how China developed independently on its own. So China and Japan were really reluctant to allow foreigners of any kind, not just Europeans, into theirs, to interact with their people, into their ports or anything. So it took military force between the Opium Wars, and we'll see in a moment when the United States opens up Japan's trading routes, because China and Japan did not want anything to do with Westerners. 1853, the United States forces Japan to open up trade with more cities than Nagasaki, and as a result of this begins the Japanese imperialism. So this is what happens. 1853, the United States superior military force, they go in, they actually force the government of China to open up more ports to them besides just the city of Nagasaki. What the Japanese people then realize is that they are not technologically advanced enough or strong enough to fend off the United States or any other Western powers. Definitely not technologically sound enough. So what they start doing, this defeat of Japan by the United States forces Japan to begin efforts to ramp up economically and technologically, so they will not have to have terms dictated to them by the Western powers. So this kind of sets off a chain reaction in South Asia. 1862, the French colonized Vietnam. 1859, China loses a war to Japan as a result of this. So we start seeing the beginnings of Japanese imperialism, and I want you guys to kind of take a look at this or keep an eye out for this as I go through the remainder of the points when we start dealing with imperialism in South Asia. 1898, the Philippines are now under the rule of the United States. They go from being ruled by Spain to being ruled by the United States. 1914, World War I, Japan fights on the side of the Allies, and Japan expands its empire. After World War I, it now part of China becomes a Japanese colony. And this is what this picture illustrates. This is just the map that shows the imperialism in Asia up until about the beginning of World War I or through World War I. And it shows, of course, each picture or each color represents Asia, how it's divided by the primary powers or the European powers or different imperialistic powers. So we see South Asia is red, representing Great Britain. We see France, Southeast Asia, Indochina, the Netherlands, Singapore, Portugal. They have part of Siam. The United States, we're here with the Philippines. Japan, which is this brownish color. They're here. They're starting to expand, though, in Spain. Okay. So this is what we start to see, and this is just shows how it was divided by this point in time. So what this map is now, it shows just talking about Japan and talking about the ramifications of going back almost 100 years of the Japanese forcing of the United States forcing their way into Japan, using the military to force Japan to trade with them. We start seeing Japan become aggressively imperialistic, ramping up their technology, ramping up their military, making sure that they become dominant powers in Asia. So by 1942, let's go back and see. I want to compare these two maps. This shows Japan, okay? So this is 1914. And this is a little bit here in Manchuria. All of this will become part of Japan eventually. Okay. Bam. But by 1942, Japan has Manchuria. It has some more of Eastern China. It's taken Burma. It's taken the Philippines, the East Indies. By 1942, using both military tactics and political tactics, Japan has expanded its empire and become a power in Southeast Asia. And all of this, once again, was set off by the United States forcing Japan into Japan to trade with the United States. That brings us to 1930 to 1945 AD. This is Japan. When I mentioned Japan using its military, Japan started using its military to conquer the United States and European colonies. Japan was strong enough by this point in time to take. They did not just have to rely on political means. They were able to, their military developed and their technology had developed to the point where they could take land by force, which is what they did. And so we see 1945 to 1975, we have the end of World War II. We start seeing the defeat of Japan in World War II. We start seeing Japan lose power. Of course, they had to cede lands back to the United States and Europe. But something interesting happened, and this follows a concept that we've discussed in South Asia as well as in Sub-Saharan Africa. Also in Latin America. After 1945, we start seeing these countries in Southeast Asia gain their independence from the imperial powers after World War II. So a lot of these countries become independent. Between the 1960s and the 1975, we see the Vietnam War, which is a product of the Cold War. You have communist-backed Vietnam. It's a civil war in Vietnam where the communists are backed by the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the democratic part of Vietnam is being backed by the United States of America. In the 1980s, let's skip forward to the 1980s until today. We see several Southeast Asian countries, which are highlighted here, especially Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan have experienced dramatic economic growth. They're given the name of the Asian Tigers. And for a period of time, Japan was in this as well. During the 1980s, it was believed that Japan would be the way that we view China in the world today is how Japan was viewed in the 1980s. But they've since experienced some different banking challenges, economic challenges, shrinking populations. So that slowed the growth of Japan. But for our purposes today, outside of China, the four Asian Tigers are Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. These are centers of banking, technology, and industry in Southeast Asia. It's where we see a lot of technology companies. We start seeing LG, Samsung, companies like that. This is where they are. Okay, so Asian Tigers. And I want to revisit a concept. I wanted to go back and discuss a little bit more about the Silk Road because I know I've mentioned it before in one or two videos, but I did want to just give you guys just to make sure that I felt good about what we were talking about with it. So just kind of look, once again, what this picture illustrates, this is the different routes or the different trade routes that were part of the Silk Road. Of course, the red are overland routes, the blue are sea routes. So, and you want to see that it goes from Egypt, Somalia, Nubia, Arabia, Persia, India, China, Java. These are all ways that these ancient civilizations traded with one another, okay? Cultural diffusion. And just kind of touching bases on it again, just recapping or reiterating, the Silk Road are interlinking trade routes across the Afro-Eurasian landmass that connected East, South, and Western Asia with the Mediterranean, the North African, and Eastern and Southern European world. The Silk Road gets its name from the lucrative Chinese silk trade. China developed silk. Remember we discussed that. The Yellow River Valley culture developed silk. Also gunpowder. They developed gunpowder. Trade on the Silk Road was a significant factor in the development of the civilizations of China, the Indian subcontinent, Persia, Europe, and Arabia. So we see that this trade, and it's no coincidence that the major civilizations, or a lot of the major civilizations or culture hubs that we see are points along the Silk Road. Here, and here. Okay, I'm sorry, here and here. Okay. Also, too, though, the disappearance of the Silk Road, and it was because of Arabs took over a part of the route, and they discontinued the Silk Road. They discontinued the trade routes, overland trade routes. But the disappearance of the Silk Road was the main driving factor for the Portuguese and other European powers to explore the Indian Ocean to find the sea routes to China and India. If you think about Columbus, you think about Amerigo Vespucci, they were all trying to find a way to India. So a way that the Silk Road, or not even in a way, the Silk Road, the end of the Silk Road in a very real way caused the age of exploration that resulted in the finding of the discovery of the Americas, North and South America by modern European powers. And so that launched the beginning of the age of exploration, which goes into a whole new topic. Remember, highlight the homework learning targets in your notes. Answer the questions in bold lettering. Have a good day. See you in class.